Hi, for those of you who don't know, my name is David.
Rachel Santini.
Tyler Tannehill.
In this presentation, we'll explore the topic religious determinism. Okay, so here's how this presentation is structured. So we'll first discuss free will, and then we'll move on to religious determinism, and we'll define that. And then we'll move on to two notable thinkers of religious determinism. One of them being St. Augustine, and Rachel will take you through that. And then the other is John Calvin, in which Tyler will take you through. And finally, we're going to finish it off with a brief summary. So sit back and enjoy. So our goal in this presentation is to answer the question, does free will exist? Based on the views of St. Augustine and John Calvin. Now first off, what exactly is free will? Well, free will is simply the power to do something without yourself being fully caused to do it. So free will allows one to make choices in their everyday life. It is an expression of the biblical concept that refers to our right, freedom, and responsibility to make the choice between God's will or our own. Here's a few biblical verses on free will. So from Proverbs 16:9, basically saying that the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. And here's another one from Joshua 24:15. And if it seems evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Now, it is important to distinguish free will and free action. For example, you might intend to eat and choose what you want to eat, but if there's no food available, you aren't really free to carry out the action of eating anymore. Religious determinism. So, religious determinism is the logical consequence of the presumed omniscience of God. Now, what in the world does this mean? Well, basically, God has foreknowledge of all events. All times are equally present to his eye. An example of religious determinism is when Jesus already knew that Judas was going to betray him, and Judas could not do anything to change his fate. Another example is that Jesus already knew his death and resurrection. Now there are two types of determinisms. There is the hard determinism and soft determinism. Let's first talk about hard determinism. Since everything, including human action, has a cause or causes that determine it to be what it is, there's no real freedom, only the illusion of freedom. People are not morally responsible for their actions, as if they could have done otherwise. Besides, we assume that training people to act in certain ways will influence their future behavior. Soft determinism, which is also called compatibilism. It is a determinism is compatible with freedom and responsibility. It's also called self-determinism. When we ourselves are the causes of actions, our actions become free.
Famed theologian St. Augustine often spoke of free will in his works. St. Augustine of Hippo, whose full name was Aurelius Augustinus, was born in 354 AD in the city of Tagaste, in the Roman North African province of Numidia, which is today known as Algeria. His father Patricius was a pagan who still adhered to the old gods of Rome, and his mother, Monica, was a devout Christian. As St. Augustine was an intellectually gifted child, his parents wanted to provide their son with a good Roman education, hoping to ensure him a prosperous career. Despite his mother's strong influence of Catholicism, Augustine was not baptized a Christian until he was in his early 30s in 386 AD. He died on August 28, 430 AD, during the siege of Hippo. Thus, his feast day is August 28th. St. Augustine attempted to reconcile his beliefs about free will, especially the belief that humans are morally responsible for their actions, with his belief that one's life is predetermined through religious determinism. He found it extremely difficult to deny that man has free will, or to deny that God has foreknowledge of future events. He believed in both, but it seemed impossible that both could coexist. St. Augustine refuted the argument that claims, whatever God foreknows must necessarily happen. For example, if God foreknows a man will sin, he must necessarily sin. St. Augustine counter-argues that though God knows we are going to will in the future, it is unproven that we necessarily and involuntarily will anything. This means that God knows the decision we are going to make. However, his knowing does not influence our decision. We humans still voluntarily make the choice on our own. One question that preoccupied St. Augustine was that if human freedom is expressed through choosing to act against God's goodness, and God is truly omniscient and omnipotent, then how can evil exist in the world? To believe in God, St. Augustine had to find an answer to why. If God is all-powerful and also purely good, why does he allow suffering to exist? In St. Augustine's mind, the solution to this question retains the all-loving and infinitely good of God, while maintaining human freedom. He states that evil exists because we have free will. God enables humans to freely choose their actions, and evil inevitably results from these choices. St. Augustine claims that the ability to commit evil acts stems from internal motivation of human beings. Even natural evils, such as disease, are indirectly related to human actions, since they become evil only when in contact with people. A disease spreads only because men and women put themselves in harm's way. Human beings are the authors of their own suffering. We bring evil on ourselves because we actively choose corruptible elements of the physical world rather than the eternal, perfect forms which are spiritual. St. Augustine argues that God does not allow evil to exist so much as we choose it by our actions and words. St. Augustine came to the conclusion that it is impossible for us to understand the mind of God, and therefore we cannot come to a proper comprehension of why suffering exists. We cannot understand the mind of God, and what appears evil to us may not be evil at all. In other words, we cannot judge God's judgment. It is his view, our Creator, versus our view, his creations. Therefore, actions which initially seem evil may actually lead to a greater, unforeseeable good in the future. Due to St. Augustine's belief in God's goodness and all-powerfulness, St. Augustine came to a conclusion: humans have free will. They ultimately choose good or evil, causing their own suffering. According to St. Augustine, there is no doubt that humans have free will. If man doesn't have free choice, God is directly responsible for man's sins, and the whole moral basis for redemption and reconciliation is undermined. God ultimately knows what will happen in the future, but humans have the choice. God doesn't choose for us. He just knows what we will choose without influencing our decision. Humans have free will, and God has the foreknowledge. For example, Adam and Eve had the true choice to express free will in original sin. God knew that Adam and Eve would sin against him. However, Adam and Eve had the true choice and ultimately chose to take a bite of that forbidden fruit.
John Calvin was born in 1509 in France. There, he studied law at multiple universities. After the death of his father in 1531, he began his studies in religion and philosophy. He was a well-educated man. Calvin became critical of problems in the French Catholic Church, such as the buying of indulgences from sins. In Paris, Calvin openly spoke out against the Church, and he became treated as a heretic. At the time, heretics were being prosecuted in Paris, so he fled Paris and roamed France, Switzerland, and Italy. In 1536, he settled in Geneva. In Geneva, John Calvin became a major figure in the Protestant Reformation, which was occurring across all of Europe. He eventually became the religious and political leader of Geneva and turned the state into a theocracy. In Geneva, Calvin fully developed his beliefs about God and wrote a book on them. John Calvin's religious beliefs became known as Calvinism. Calvinism has a full belief in God's omnipresence and God's omnipotence. That is, God is everywhere and God is all-powerful. It also has a belief that because of God's omnipresence and omnipotence, God is able to experience the past, present, and future all at once, and thus already knows the future. Therefore, everything is pre-known and predestined by God, making Calvinism a form of hard determinism. John Calvin was a big believer of predestination. He stated that because God is all-knowing, God has already decided those who will be saved, the elect, and those who will be eternally damned, the reprobates. The elect were pre-chosen and could never fall from God's grace. One's destination of heaven or hell was therefore already determined by God and could not be changed. John Calvin does not believe in free will because, according to Calvin, our fates have already been determined by God and we have no free choice of our own about this.
In the beginning of this presentation, I asked the question, does free will exist? As we have learned, there are two premises to this question, one from St. Augustine and the other from John Calvin. St. Augustine believes in free will, whereas John Calvin argues against free will. So, which side would you choose?